Hello and welcome to William and Mary's presentation here at the Asian American Studies Conference of the Association for Asian American Studies. My name is Francis Nanglao Aguas, and today I'm here with my colleague, Professor Dinesh Sohoni, and our student, Brian Zhao, from William and Mary to present to you Asian Milestones in Academia's Platforms for Agency, a workshop on platforms centralizing Asian American studies. My colleagues will introduce themselves when their turn at the presentation comes. So the overview, first we'll talk a little bit about the Asian Centennial, followed by the Asian Pacific, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian Research Project, student-faculty collaboration. Then our student Brian Zhao will talk about the PK Chen exhibit. Then Professor Sohoni will also address the K-12 Asian American Studies Education Initiative, or CASE. So the first topic, which is my section, is restaging the gaze of the spectacle, leveraging academia's currencies to build platforms centralizing Asian American studies. Particularly during the age of COVID, with anti-Asian hate, our Asian Centennial, though not planned, became a central platform for dialogue and community. And so on April the 1st, as a result of the unfortunate murders in Atlanta of our Asian American sisters, friends, relatives, our community led by students led a community vigil for against Asian hate. And so this was our largest event so far in April, and it was really student-led. The question that we're answering here in an institution that is rooted and steeped in enslavement of labor is how can we centralize Asian American studies in spaces such as William and Mary that deliberately and carefully are constructed by white patriarchy, in our case in 1693. And here is a quote from one of our most famous students, Thomas Jefferson, and how he felt about the enslaved laborers who built his institution, the University of Virginia. Our program, the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program, is a product of faculty-student collaboration. And here we're sharing with you how we have diversified space in our shoe-free and Western furniture-free space. We truly collaborate eye to eye, heart to heart with our students at William and Mary. And this paves the way for us to research the history of early Asian students, which came to my attention in 2006 when my student in a course, Asian American History in Action, Anthony Elopre, brought me an old magazine article about Art Matsu, who came in 1924. And in this slide, you will see sort of the historical timeline by which these students attended. There's a sequencing to the process of creating a platform such as Asian Centennial. First, we envision, and when we envision, we identify the needs or goals of the community or unit for output and actionable items. After that, with our partners, we create an action plan. How can visibility ameliorate or accelerate the vision that we have agreed upon? In order to do a strong action plan, we need to create a 360 institutional analysis, meaning we need to identify the currencies of the institution precisely because of the title of this. In our institution, the most salient and most valuable currency is history, right? Anything about being the first, not necessarily being the best, but being the first. So this was what we leverage. And so in order to do that, we have to cultivate allies, partners in brainstorming, envisioning, and strategizing, even in the creation of the proposal. After that, what was really instrumental to our work is the creation of a pitch deck, really a tool for marketing and business, a deck of slides, a graphic pitch demonstrating our due diligence, including budget, action plan, calendar, and contacts. And it's pretty detailed already at the onset so that there doesn't have to be a lot of committee discussion that, as we know, sort of delays actionable items and outputs. And the number 6 is to think for the long term, that even after the celebration and commemoration is done, is that we should be able to have some output that will materialize for the future generations of faculty and students so that we can have sustainability and continuance. And above all this, the most important one that really is material here and is in the, you could say it's in the minutiae, but it is crucial, is branding, that we have to have a unified and consistent visual and graphic look because we do live in a capitalistic society. So in the vision pitch deck, I'm gonna share with you. You can read for yourself what's on the slide. Above all of it, our Professor Sohoni and I were always consciously telling everyone that the Asian Centennial belongs to all of us in the university. It is not only the centennial, not only of Asian, Pacific Islanders, Middle Eastern people or their departments, but the whole university, so that everyone should have an investment and stake in it. And this includes, in the pitch deck on the right, the fact that it was crucial for us to include in our pitch that convocation, charter day, commencement, the currencies of visibility have the theme of the Asian Centennial in mind and heart. And these are the pitch deck. You'll see them in order. They include the historical timeline, the departments and people that we were going to solicit for the Asian Centennial Committee, of course, our purpose, right, our actionable purpose, and even 3 phases of commemoration, right? As I said, it's important to have a plan. Spring 2021, we had to mitigate COVID, right? Like we had to change our plans and we had to be fluid, but at the same time, we had to be quite organized, as you can see here. I'll give you a little time to look at these slides. Co-sponsorships and partnerships are crucial. Even before we made the pitch, we reached out to our partners to solicit support. And the slide on the top left, you see that our vehicles for sustainability are there, our output, a film, art, our partners are listed, and the graphics are sort of laden with the history that we were presenting, including yearbook photos of historical students, right? They don't always have to be in the 1920s. Above all this, none of this could have happened without the partnership of upper administration, specifically the president and the provost. I would hope that other institutions have also equally supportive presidents, provosts, and deans as we have had. And one of the stories we tell is that even in the researching of the earlier students like Art Matsu, who was our quarterback from 24 to 27, 1924 to 27, our own president, Catherine A. Rowe, was communicating consistently with us in reaching out to family, that she was invested in the work that we were doing. And it wasn't just a ceremonial role, but she took an active role. And these are the departments, just to show you, breaking down the departments that we pursued, because we wanted our committee to be diverse. We wanted to have equity. We wanted to have access, to provide access for staff members, for people who are not necessarily professors. It was a university-wide effort, including, of course, alumni and even the community. This is a slide on branding, just to let you know that we had a full suite of branding for logos and graphics and templates. And just about 3 days ago, our street signage in time for our big end of the Centennial celebrations, that the whole town was decked in the Asian Centennial branding so that the community knows what's going on inside our campus. In the community impact, right, in the most visceral impact, it is the fact that our community relationship is led by our own alum, Ben Ming Zhang, who was the first Asian elected to the city council. And with the current another alumni being on the board or the council of the town, we were able to solicit from them, upon their own initiative, a declaration of support that the city of Williamsburg is committed to providing comprehensive support to ensure that Virginia is equitable and welcoming of all people, especially in the wake of increased bigoted crimes against Asian Americans in recent months. So this for us is quite an important output as a result of the Centennial. In terms of changing the space, one of our students, Art Matsu, our quarterback, he is being honored with the renaming of the Welcome Rotunda or arcade to the football field, with his name being the only name on display of Asian descent on campus. Our sustainable platforms include our arts fellowships in film, fine arts, theater arts. The arts work, there are 5 pieces, and we are going to be making a documentary film, which we hope to pitch to at least local PBS affiliates, so that, again, we're trying to reach a wider audience with the history that our research project is unearthing. And this is a slide about our arts workshop and how we are utilizing the arts to foreground the works of the underrepresented, but also making sure that we have local community creating this art. Our artist, Roberto Hamora, is from Hampton Roads. So it wasn't necessarily bringing worldwide famous folks to tell the story of William and Mary, but we wanted a community effort. Our students are our strongest and sustained partners. In next week, they are producing the Asian Centennial Ball, which really is the first true celebration that's not necessarily academically based. So we are very happy to attend this Asian Centennial Ball. Now, globally, in terms of visibility and impact, we were very fortunate enough through the collaboration and support of our colleague, Professor Benedito Ferrao, who connected us with globally renowned author Arundhati Roy, author of The God of Small Things, who will be attending William and Mary on a visit in 2023. But on April 20, Viet Thanh Nguyen will be presented with the Hatsuya Yamasaki Prize and will be giving the McSwain Lecture on campus at William and Mary. And for us, this is a way of showing our campus community that the Asian Centennial is able to attract the participation of renowned world figures such as Viet Thanh Nguyen and Arundhati Roy, so that it can solicit respect and valuing for our APM students, faculty, and staff from the wider community. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Dinesh Sohoni.
Thank you, Francis. My name is Dinesh Sohoni, and I am the director of the APIA program at William & Mary, and with Francis, I am the co-chair of the Asian Centennial. One of the key things that we wanted to make sure was that we wanted to create also an academic component for the Asian Centennial, and we wanted to have faculty-student collaboration and researching about Asian American history at William & Mary. And a key part of this was teaching and research for diversity and inclusion, where we were training students to become researchers by researching on the histories of Asian Americans at William & Mary. So one of the things that we wanted to do was, at William & Mary, one of the things is we wanted to make sure our students know how to do research and advanced research techniques. And we were able to utilize the librarians, archivists at William & Mary's libraries to help students learn how to do research in archives. And so students signed up for independent study and learned how to work in terms of doing archival research, but the archival research was, we had the people who were the experts on the archival research be able to train the students on how to use our archives. So we also wanted to make sure that when we started looking at these histories, that students knew the context of what was happening at the time these students were coming here. And so we also partnered with the law school to conduct legal research about the legal history of the time periods. So one of the things that the earliest students who came here on a Boxer Indemnity fellowships was that we were in Virginia, there was purity acts that were preventing marriage between whites and people from other races. And so we were able to kind of show where Virginia was in terms of race relations while these students were attending the class. And my student, Brian, will be talking a little bit more about that in his formal presentation. So what we wanted to also do is make sure that our research wasn't limited to just the classroom. We wanted to create research that we could convert into public and scholarly outputs. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that the research could be utilized for students to learn how to do formal academic presentations. And so we've had our students who've worked on this project give presentations, and we've been really lucky that we've been able to do these presentations in more public venues. So we had one presentation at the library that we were able to invite faculty from across the campus, and we've also had presentations for community. But the idea also is that we're creating a sustainable form of research where students can start looking at this methodology and the types of things that we're finding to develop their own capstone projects, honors theses, or what I'll talk about a little later is we also envision this being something that can help the community. And so one of the things that students have been starting to do is create lesson plans that can be used in K-12 education. And for the professors who are working with this, we can also work on our working on scholarly articles, but working with this with undergraduate researchers as co-authors or as researchers on these projects. So to kind of give an illustration of work that was done as honors theses, one of the ones obviously that kind of helped set up the Asian Centennial originally was Benming Zhang developed a self-designed major before we had the API major at William and Mary, and he wrote his thesis on Art Matsu, called Arthur Matsu's College Years, historicize his 1920s experience. And a kind of side note, we originally had planned to have more time to prepare for our centennial because we thought he was the first student, but some other students were able to find that there were actually 2 international students from China who predated Art Matsu by a couple of years. So a key component obviously is that for minority students and other students at a traditional place where William and Mary, there's this kind of lack potentially of histories of Asian Americans at the school. And what we wanted to utilize is to show that the Asian American present existed. And so a key part of our research was studying neglected histories, so histories of Asian Americans in higher education. But we didn't want to make it kind of partitioned. So we also wanted to contextualize it with respect to other minority histories. So one of the key things was we recognize even as William and Mary started to accept Asian Americans and Asian students, that African Americans, it would be another 30 years before African Americans would be coming to William and Mary. And we also wanted to kind of contextualize that these kind of histories tend to be forgotten. And so to make this out into open, to note that Asian Americans who are here in the present can trace the histories to pioneers from earlier periods. So I'm going to pass it on to one of the first big projects that we started to do at as part of the APM research project, which is the research component of the Asian Centennial. And 2 of my students worked with me on this, Brian Zhao and Sumie Yatsukura. And I asked them as part of independent study to come up with a public way to present a research project, and this is what they developed. So I will let Brian introduce himself.
Oh yeah, Professor Honey, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. But yeah, so the project that we were able to sort of work on is really stem from Sumie, which is this awesome archival find from the William and Mary Literary Magazine from 1923, just kind of looking around at these old special collections. And we came across something, and she sent it to all of us, and it was just something that really spoke to the Asian American experience back then, now, and we thought that we could kind of supplement that and insert commentary about the social, political, historical context, as well as the sort of local, national, and international context as well, in which these sort of this piece was birthed in. And so just a couple of pictures of, again, this was an exhibit to kind of engage the community, available in our library in SWAM. There was a opening, and we presented it a couple of times, but so the Centennial and talking about Pukao Chen, again, we start with this piece, which he writes in the literary magazine. It's a Chinese student's first impression of America. And one of the things that I think is important to highlight is that there was a lot of work done prior to us, and there was a lot of help that we got from the different outlets and resources that Professor Aguas sort of pointed to as well, that guided us through kind of creating this final product. And what I think is just really great, and what we love so much about the piece, is we just really wanted to take Chen's words, his writing, and center it, and try and craft a narrative and fill in gaps in order to kind of tell a story. And so here we just start with adding the background information of how does someone like P.K. Chen in 1921 arrive at William and Mary. And what's really interesting, and something that we highlight, is by 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act had already been passed. We had seen up until that point, actually, a lot of different legislation that was targeting immigrants specifically from Asia. One of the things that a lot of people may not know, though, is that these laws didn't target certain groups, or they provided exceptions for certain groups, that being specifically those who were seen as integral to US foreign interests, those being government officers, merchants, sons of merchants, missionaries, and students. And so how this sort of flow of students kind of came to be is actually rooted in the Boxer Rebellion. And so with the Boxer Rebellion, the United States was, along with what was owed to them for this sort of, this sort of outlash against foreign domination. And one of the things that was advocated for was there was a set amount of money that was given to the United States that it obviously just couldn't justify. And so one of the government officials from China actually advocated through years of lobbying to try and return this money. The United States was actually very hesitant at first, saying, well, what if the money just is squandered? And so there is this sort of racial element of the Chinese government not being able to manage these sort of funds. And so it was instead created into a scholarship. And so that's how P.K. Chen's origins actually kind of come, or where his origins come from. And so he was a part of Tsinghua University, or Tsinghua College at the time, which was essentially a feeder school to these sort of schools in the United States. And he talks really interestingly about his sort of journey to the United States, and details it incredibly well. And so he talks about how in the summer of 1921 from Shanghai, he boarded onto the steamship China and sailed with a bunch of other men from Tsinghua College. And what's interesting about this is these students who are on the boat with P.K. Chen, through the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship, they were plentiful. They went to schools all over the nation, as we'll see sort of in the next slide. They went to schools such as MIT, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, Ohio State, Michigan, some of these really big staples. And what we tried to do is just paint a picture of what this sort of leaving from Shanghai, this idea of setting sail and arriving to a place that no one's ever sort of, you have heard of, but don't really know and haven't experienced. And so Chen arrives to San Francisco. It comes through Angel Island. Incredibly, because of the sort of detail in his writing, I was able to track down through the National Archives and Records Administration his entry into the United States. And so here highlighted is just sort of talking about how he came into the United States, how he was processed. And if you can actually look closely, these are all other students as well that are coming to the States, incredibly going to all of these different schools as sort of touched upon prior. But what we thought was so interesting about this sort of letter, or what the sort of piece details, is he talks about his impression of America being highly favorable by this time, this sort of allure of San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, that many of his dreams were somehow realized. Going to the University of California, seeing the sunny streets. But as he kind of goes on to write, he says, "I'm afraid that this wonderful demonstration at San Francisco and its irresistible effects upon our minds were directly responsible for the subsequent disappointments and mental depressions of many of my companions as well as myself." And that was something that we really thought was central to sort of highlight, I think this idea of going to a place that we don't know much about is sort of maybe a universal sort of feeling of setting sail. But Chen sort of comes to terms and grapples with throughout this piece his sort of racialization as other, as foreign. And that's kind of what we really wanted to highlight as well, talking about what he was met with when coming to William and Mary, being on campus. And so this is where, as a group, we kind of wanted to talk about the historical context, the local context. And so one of the things that I think is really most interesting, as Professor Sohoni sort of alluded to, but that in 1924, just simply a year after he graduated, the Virginia General Assembly would go on to pass the Racial Integrity Act, which was Virginia's own anti-miscegenation law. But even prior to that, for example, John Powell, the famous and noted pianist, formed the Anglo-Saxon Club of America, even though technically he wasn't allowed because he wasn't affiliated or faculty with the school, but somehow that just happened to be. But there were also other things too. So we take and highlight from the Flat Hat, for example, our school's newspaper from April 2nd, 1921, this idea that Chen writes in his letter, and being in Chicago, getting called Chinaman, which he describes was a great discomfort. And incredibly, this is something that I didn't really even know about, but the notion that Chinese male laborers, while being booked through the immigration process, if you were unable to pronounce their name or know their name, you just call them John, and obviously they're a Chinaman, designating their sort of laboring status. And I think what's really interesting as well, and kind of reading this, is he also talks about, and it kind of details his class position as well, that Chen writes, "I do admit that some of my compatriots in America do disgrace their country and do deserve some condemnation, but it should be remembered that they belong to the lowest stratum of the Chinese society, not at all representative of the great masses at home." And so in a lot of ways, Chen here is trying to grapple with positing himself and recognizing this truth that, yes, there are some Asians who are, undesirable, but, they're not representative of all, and kind of distancing himself from those populations as well. And what we think is really integral is, that Chen talks about, is this idea of representation, the difference between the East and the West, or the reification of the Orient. And it's something that he struggles with a lot, which is really, really interesting. And we thought that it would be an important point to talk about, because William and Mary would actually go on to invite D.W. Griffith, the film producer of The Birth of a Nation, to campus. J.A.C. Chandler in 1923 would invite and host a luncheon. But what a lot of people don't know about Griffith is that he actually would have his own sort of other racist caricature film, which is less known and less notable because it wasn't played at the White House with Woodrow Wilson, but Broken Blossoms as well. This sort of very vile, virulent sort of depiction of an Asian man, the quote unquote Oriental horde, and the sort of the need to kind of police these borders and being a secure nation through blood and other things. And so what I think always stands out to me while looking at this is how Chen is grappling with this idea of representation, and how he kind of inverts it and flips it on its head. He writes, another cause of misrepresentation is that of the moving picture of media, of film, that carries a wrong impression into the mind of the audience. That such pictures are monstrously exaggerating can be indirectly proved by the following instance. It was my belief when I was in China that Americans at home were either as smart as Harold Lloyd or at least as funny as Charlie Chaplin, for both these personages are no mean favorites on Chinese screens. And I think this is really, really interesting, right? How he's trying to come to terms with and recognizing the way that representation plays a role in thinking of stereotype, how he's perceived and recognized, but also still giving credence to the missionaries who understand and know China, perhaps that he says better than I do. But what I think speaks most and is perhaps most interesting is he talks about the missionaries, he talks about representation, and he ends his letter in the William and Mary Literary Magazine in his final year at the college. And he says, China certainly regards America as her best friend, both from the standpoint of international relations and from the influence American missionaries have exerted. In this workaday world, she has much yet and is turning to America for guidance, as America is indisputably the light of the world today. China wishes to be rightly understood, particularly to Americans at home. And we just think this is a very poignant sort of ending, this sort of openness, this amiable sort of desire to still be understood and have a relationship with the United States. And so Chen's story is just one of many that we think, and what we're trying to do, specifically me as being one of the people who's done a lot of research on the project, we recognize that Chen's story is, there's so much in that one piece, and we're hoping to be able to find more and center the voices of these different students, trying to find their literary works, their notes, what they did at William and Mary, but also how they came to arrive there and what they would become after, and kind of recognizing this as a repository of stories, of projects to be able to tell and reassert into our community, but also on campus and in different spaces. And so with that, I'll be sure to hand it over to both of my colleagues, Professor Aguas and Professor Sohoni.
Thank you, Brian. So for the continuing projects, okay, just let it. For the continuing projects, as mentioned before, the Zabel Stadium Arcade will be named after Arthur A. Matsu, and this took a special action of the Board of Visitors. Usually, any naming on campuses across the United States requires a sizable donation, but because of the support of the President, the Provost, and the Board of Visitors, we were able to solicit this quite historic event. At the same time, because of Benny Zhang's thesis, supervised by our colleague, Professor R. Benedito Ferrao, in 2016, which was propagated, and middle school students in Cumberland, Virginia, we think and believe, read this work and inspired them to participate in a Commonwealth-wide competition for historical markers from the Department of Transportation for Art Matsu as a historical figure to commemorate. So they won, their proposal won, and there is now a Commonwealth of Virginia historical marker honoring the legacy of Matsu, not only as a quarterback and athletic coach, but also as a student leader. Because when he was on campus, in his own way, he was advocating for more diversity and for more participation of the white students in the lives of the mostly staff of African-American descent through the Order of the White Jacket. And even in his life as an alum, he kept writing the administration of William and Mary to remind them to keep this tradition alive. And also, he also kept fighting for his right to be an American citizen during World War II. So all of this will be a part of our continued research led by my colleague, Professor Sohoni.
So similar to what we did with P.K. Chen, we're seeking to highlight some of the other historical figures and because of the prominence of Arthur Matsu, we are conducting research on him that helped facilitate some of these other kind of broader things like the naming of the stadium. Whoops. Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to do was create sustainable research. So even though the Asian Centennial is going to be finishing up the end of this year, we wanted to make sure that we are able to sustain some of the momentum that we've created. And so the APM research project is going to continue research on these historical figures. And besides Art Matsu, we also had some of the first Asian American women coming to William and Mary right before World War II and after World War II. And we had Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. And so we wanted to kind of put their experiences within this historical context of who are enemies, who are our allies, and how does that shape Americans who are of Asian descent. And we also wanted to make sure that this isn't just limited to kind of small audiences. So what we're doing is developing, using GIS, we're doing story maps so that we can put these on platforms so that this is accessible research for high schoolers or other researchers to be able to access these stories in a way that allows it to be spread not just to our local community, but to other communities. So a larger kind of continuing project that we sought was that as parents within the local community, we frequently find ourselves invited to talk about Asian Americans at our local schools. And there's been a lack of Asian American content throughout the United States, but particularly in Virginia, we frequently see that many of our students who are coming to William and Mary who went to schools in Virginia actually don't know a lot of the history of Asian Americans within Virginia or within the United States. And so the CASE initiative, or making the case for K-12 Asian American studies, what we wanted to use is local stories like the ones that we are working at William and Mary, but create lesson plans that could be utilized by K-12 educators and that they would be able to access it. So we partnered with the School of Education where we take our research and we work with the School of Education to create course material for classes like geography or world history or even English, if we find these different primary sources that can be utilized. And using people in the School of Education, and in this case, our colleague, Professor Esther Kim, that she would work with our students in converting this into specific lesson plans. And then we would also bring in K-12 educators to look at how we are to make accessible our research for those who are interested in including into their curriculums. And recently we found out that we had applied for a grant from the Breitmeyer Foundation to pursue this work. And so we received a $35,000 grant, and this, and William and Mary is supplementing this with, we also received a, what's called a Charles Center grant, which is allows for undergraduate researchers to work as a team to during the summer to do the research that will become part of the K-12 educational lesson plans. So before I turn over this back to Professor Tangla Aguas to finish up here, what I wanted to kind of present was that the idea of taking our scholarship, creating opportunities for students, but then also getting it into the public realm where we're trying to get younger students to be able to become knowledgeable about the diversity that existed in our history that they don't often see. So, Francis?
This slide encapsulates not even 20% of the total events, activities, and programs that our community was able to offer. In the beginning of this presentation, I declared that our mantra was the Asian Centennial is not only the centennial of Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian Americans, but of the whole university. And we're happy to report that at William & Mary, indeed, units, departments, students, faculty, and staff really have reached out to our community in support, not only of by making programming, but also that these programs were their way of telling us how much they valued and supported our community, especially in the 2 years and still ongoing of anti-Asian hate. And at the end of the day, that is the overarching thesis or message that the Asian Centennial wants to communicate, is that these people, Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian Americans, are human beings that deserve respect, even if there are no books or movies made about them. But inherently, through the programming that include arts, scholarship, and community events, that we have hoped to have humanized the members of these diverse communities. We thank you for your time. We hope that you were able to learn and be inspired to create your own platforms for agency, whether you're students, faculty, or community members at large in areas where there are people descended from Asia, Pacific, and the Middle East, Southwest Asia. We thank you for your time. Our contact info is there, and we wish you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Because now we can put that on. No, it's stopped. Don't worry. Still recording?